In 2020, almost overnight, Covid-19 shut down galleries, concert halls, theatres and live venues. Well, 1 year on, we can now begin to estimate the impact on the incomes of the self-employed artists who worked in them. Hello, Alexander. Welcome.
Hello, Tim.
Now, Alexander, there are quite a few people who might claim to be artists. That claim's not always true. Which jobs have you included in your research?
Well, we included jobs, first of all, that generate self-employed income from artistic practice. And basically, this included artists that were either writers, performing artists, visual artists, as well as musicians. So you may say this is a rather tight definition of the creative and cultural sectors, but we believe the research really accounts for an important labor market segment, and it covers very well that non-standard employment that is quite common in those sectors.
And it's the artistic community in Germany that you've been investigating. Where did you get the data for your research?
Well, it actually comes from an interesting dedicated social insurance scheme for artists that are located in Germany. And actually the scheme is quite unique in Europe. And basically their artists self-identify when they register and when they apply for the insurance scheme. Because then they're really asked to provide proof on their past artistic practice. And once they're registered, the artists are required to report annual income to that authority, and basically that is used to calculate and adjust insurance fees.
You've looked at their income and the impact on their income from COVID-19, but can you be confident that this earnings data that you've got is representative of what they really are earning?
Yeah, I'm pretty confident that the data is really high quality. And there's almost 200,000 artists that are insured under the scheme. And I believe it's actually superior data to much of the survey data that has been collected during that first year of the pandemic. What is also interesting is that the insurance agency randomly inspects and double checks with tax authorities if the reported income can be confirmed with their data. So I think there's a bit of a enforcement mechanism, you may call it, in place that makes sure that people report, let's say, more truthfully. And there are, of course, limits to the data, as with any data. For example, data from the insurance scheme might not very well cover the top tier incomes, because at some stage there comes an incentive in to actually opt out of the scheme and seek alternative private insurance. But that's at a very high level, a very high threshold. And so I still believe we capture the majority of the self-employed population of artists that are located in Germany. And of course, one of the ideas and one of the value of the research is really that it wants to provide timely evidence that can actually inform the current policies that we need to develop quick and fast. And so that was one reason we couldn't wait for any other official source to release more comprehensive data.
Well, as you say, it's pretty rare to have data of this sort of richness for these kind of professions, isn't it? So let's see what it tells us. First of all, in the pandemic, how many jobs were lost in this sector?
To be frank, that's something that our data doesn't directly tell us, unfortunately. We did look, however, into potential changes in the number of insured people under the scheme. As an indication, and actually there we didn't find any indication that many artists were dropping out during the pandemic and maybe quitting their jobs. There are, however, for example, studies from the UK where that explicitly address labor market contractions, as I would call them, and their estimates, they range around 30% decline in jobs in music, performing and visual arts. But that, again, is just a change between the first and third quarter of the 2020, and it's not covering the whole year. Well, what I can almost certain tell is that many artists reduce working hours, which also has an impact on their annual income, of course. And that's also confirmed by that UK study I just mentioned.
Well, okay, then let's look at what the data does directly measure. What has been the impact on incomes?
Well, in 2020 alone, the net income losses in self-employed income, they range between 2 to 13%, depending on the specific sector that you actually look at. I believe that 2021 will possibly add to that, but of course, no such data is available to actually cover that as well. What is good about our 2020 estimates for the pandemic is that they're likely not heavily biased by public funding and support, because most of the public money meant for artists, for example from recovery packages, took some time to distribute within the federal structures of Germany.
Did all types of artists suffer equally, or were some more badly affected than others?
That is one of our main findings, really. It's musicians and performing artists that seem to be among the most vulnerable groups, and they're really hit hardest if you look at the estimates. And it's possibly because they cannot perform live on stages, and for them it's really an important income source. In contrast, which is interesting, I find, is that writers such as self-employed and freelance journalists, authors or other publicists, and I hope you can confirm that from your anecdotal evidence, seem to be quite resilient in the crisis. They maintain or even sometimes slightly increase their self-employed income in 2020. Maybe, that's the educated guess I can offer, they were better able to continue their work online when theatres and concert venues were long closed.
Well, anecdotally, I can confirm that because as a writer, I just sat at this desk and a lot of my colleagues who were in the performing arts, well, they did suffer. But let's have a look at another category. We have spent a lot of time in these videos discussing the different gender impact on many occupations of COVID-19. Is there a gender difference in the impact of COVID-19 for artists?
Yeah, that's another surprise finding from our original WIPO research. It's really that female writers seem to be the most resilient group and outperform the trends among their male writing counterparts in 2020. So during the crisis, you may say the income gap is actually closing a tiny little bit between in that specific artistic category. This may be because work arrangements of female writers were more flexible eventually, even before the crisis arrived. But to be very clear, at large, the gender differences, as well as the gaps between different career stages, they largely prevail over the crisis, and they really predate the 2020 outbreak. They're still quite substantial. So, for example, the post-crisis gender gap still ranges between 10 to 35%, depending on the specific sector you look at. And the gap's most prominent in the performing and visual arts, actually. And it's interesting if you compare that to the total population, that it's actually in many sectors of the cultural and creative industries, it's actually higher than the average pay gap in the total population in Germany.
I see in the paper that you investigated the impact of policy interventions, lockdowns, closures, that kind of thing, in different regions in Germany. How much variation was there in Germany? How much impact did this have on artist incomes?
Yeah, first of all, I need to step back a bit or give you a disclaimer there. It's not that we can really causally relate a specific non-pharmaceutical public intervention, let's say X days of lockdown related to a change in income of X. So we cannot relate that causally, but what we see is correlations, and they might nevertheless be interesting. Because we have that federal structure, as I said, it's actually quite some individual states actually differed when they set up different measures and what measures they actually chose to implement. So that's something we can exploit in the analysis. So for example, in the case of performing artists and fine artists, their overall negative impact that comes from the crisis is slightly reduced with more days of lockdown. They have less of a net income loss. So that's interesting, and I see this at least as indicative that as time passes, these artists and institutions they work with, they might be able to slowly, bit by bit, uncover new income sources and adopt maybe some new business practices that are actually profitable. And that may be a shift to online streaming, or it may be a shift to online sales. But these are things that we really need to confirm with more research.
Now, all over the world, then, artists who manage to earn 100% of their income from whatever it is that they do, they're either very lucky or very talented. So we can assume that many of these artists have 2 or 3 sources of income. Were you able to capture the impact on those other sources of income, or whether they worked more on other jobs to make up for the income that they lost?
Well, no, unfortunately not. Our data doesn't capture that directly. So artists, when they're insured under that scheme for the artistic self-employment, up to a certain threshold, they may still hold other typically regular employment jobs at the same time, as you said. And this is where the question of ultimate impact really gets tricky, because we cannot observe how the crisis impacted on these other jobs that some artists use to actually cross-subsidize their artistic practice. So our results are really restricted to the impact on their self-employment income from artistic practice, and that includes a possibility that there's a more complicated mechanism operating in the background when artists are forced to change the way they work in multiple jobs in due course, which is something we cannot observe.
Now, in many places, the theatres, the concert halls, they're opening up again. People are going back to watch bands play. Certainly in the UK, this has been greeted with a lot of relief by the artistic community. But do you think that there's going to be permanent damage to artistic incomes? Do we need policy to protect our artistic community that we don't have in place at the moment?
Well, I find it difficult to actually, at this point in time, to judge, to make a trustable estimate where the damages will be permanent and whether will be not. And it's unclear at this point to me how much public policies and those recovery packages will actually make up for the income losses among artists, and how much public support, public or private support, may actually help rebuild some of the cultural institutions and creative places such as theaters, nightclubs, makerspaces, whatever, that may not actually survive the pandemic, because there may be some. That is also a question of policy priority, I believe. I'm not sure it really needs new policies. There is already a number of policies, such as cultural policies, of course, copyright policies, but also social safety net policy and various other that together then can actually help address financial vulnerability of certain groups of artists. For copyright, working for United Nations, for World Intellectual Property Organization, I can say that some national policies, some legal frameworks explicitly try to target the improvement of bargaining positions for individual creators and markets vis-à-vis more dominant industry stakeholders. So that is one possible road I see to follow to improve the financial health of artists in the longer term, if that is what policies want to achieve. The second point I would want to highlight, and which sometimes is forgotten, is that some of the impact of the pandemic may actually be indeed positive. The pandemic seems to have served as a catalyst to digitization, and artists and it may actually have encouraged in some places artistic collaboration and production. That is at least what survey evidence that goes well beyond our data suggests. So maybe in some creative sectors, previously lagging behind, and maybe in the past being more reluctant to new technologies, we might hopefully see some efficiency and productivity gains in the near future.
Well, as a positive note on which to finish, and I think a positive note that we really need at the moment, that Alexander, it's very interesting work on a very hard to measure sector, isn't it? Thank you for telling me about it today.
Thank you, Tim.
The paper is called COVID-19's Impact on Artistic Income, and the authors are Alexander Cuntz and Matthias Sali. It's in COVID Economics 82. Well, thanks for watching. Covid Economics is taking a break at the moment, but remember all the issues are still online, free and open access at CEPR.org.